Hello, everyone. This is Piero San Giorgio. It is my great pleasure today to host Amy Chua. Amy, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Piero.
Amy, you're a professor of law at Yale, but beyond that, you're very, very famous. You're a public personality in the United States, and everyone knows you from your very, very big bestseller, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. But
My notorious book, yeah.
it was a great book. It helped me to try to find out how to be a tiger father to the children that I have. But that's not the first book I read about you. It was World on Fire in 2002, and we're celebrating almost 20 years of the publishing of that book. And I was curious, how 20 years later do you feel about this book? Do you feel vindicated about what was written in it?
Yes, I do. Although there have been some modifications and developments too. For your audience members who don't know what the book is about, well, first, the English title is very incendiary. The book was called World on Fire: How Exporting Free Market Democracy Breeds Ethnic Hatred and Global Instability. A big mouthful. And, now I think after Iraq and Afghanistan, people seem to think, yeah, of course. But if you remember, you and I were contrary voices. I mean, 20 years ago, this is, for your younger viewers, right after the Soviet Union collapsed. So all over the world, there was this feeling that, communism and authoritarianism failed. So the only thing left is capitalism and democracy. So let's put it everywhere. Let's ship it everywhere, to Iraq and Afghanistan and, Latin America and Southeast Asia. And I remember Francis Fukuyama, whom I admire a lot, wrote, The End of History. And I was a contrary voice, partly for autobiographical reasons, because my own family is from a tiny Chinese minority. They grew up in the Philippines. And the central theme of my book, World on Fire, centered on the idea of what I called a market-dominant minority. And this is a very small minority, that's an outsider minority, like the Chinese, like my own family, in countries like the Philippines or Indonesia or Thailand or Vietnam. And most Westerners don't know about it. I think they think all Asians look kind of the same. But in the Philippines, the Chinese were only 1% of the population, and yet they controlled 70 to 80% of the private economy. Same with Indonesia, huge country. Chinese there were only 3% of the population, but controlled about 70% of the economy. And the thesis was that in countries with this market dominant minority, which at the time, I believe that the countries of Europe did not have, France, the United States, England, Canada, we pretty much had a dominant white majority, that controlled both the economy and politics, the French majority or the white American majority. We didn't have a phenomenon where an outsider ethnic minority was very politically weak and yet controlled so much of the economy. And what I said was that if in these countries you suddenly bring in free market democracy, just democratize overnight, you are not going to have a happy story, peace and prosperity. Americans always romanticize elections. Not since Donald Trump, but before that, everybody said, let's just have elections. But what I said in 2002 was that in many developing countries, including in the Middle East, if you suddenly have elections, it's going to be a disaster, because in these countries where you have a very resented minority that's viewed as controlling all the power and the media and all the banks, if you suddenly have majority rule, it's going to lead to revenge. This poor, resentful majority will use their political power to either kick out the minority or confiscate from them or kill them. And this is exactly what happened in Iraq. It's a little bit different there. The market dominant minority was the Sunni. It's not ethnic, but it's a sectarian difference. They were about 14% of the population, and the Sunnis had controlled and dominated Iraq for hundreds of years. First under the Ottomans, that was a Sunni power, then under the British, because they loved divide and conquer to favor this minority, and finally under, of course, Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni, and he really favored, his own clan among the Sunnis and persecuted the majority Shias and Kurds. And I don't take that much pleasure, although a little bit of academic pleasure, but I was right. I predicted, I had many colleagues who disagreed with me. At Harvard, Noah Feldman criticized me. He said, you focus too much on ethnic conflict. If we have elections, the Sunnis and Shias will come together and make coalitions and intermarry, and it'll be great. But the result was disaster. It was exactly what happened. There were ethno-nationalist movements, demagogues, and eventually, actually, the small Sunnis decided this majority rule is not working for us, and that's how ISIS started. Because they decided we might as well join the insurgency because democracy is not working out for us at all. We feel persecuted. Yeah. So that was the thesis from 2002, and I do feel vindicated after what happened in Iraq, but also other countries too, like, not exactly the same dynamic, but I wrote about Indonesia, and believe it or not, about, this is in my new book, Venezuela with Hugo Chavez. It's a little bit different, Piero, because in Venezuela, it's not like black and white or, Chinese and Filipino, but the elites in Venezuela, like many Latin American countries, are the lighter skinned European elites. And they also were market dominant. They controlled everything. And when Hugo Chavez came in, he acted exactly like these ethno-nationalist leaders that I'd written about. He scapegoated the market dominant minority. He said, look, all these oligarchs that control everything. Vote for me. I look like an Indian. I have, I look like an African. He really played the ethnicity. He said, look at my face. I have dark skin, and all these poor people voted for him. So I've seen this phenomenon kind of replay itself with slight variations all over the world in the last 20 years.
And of course, 20 years after, of course, it was a courageous book after September 11. I certainly remember that if you were against the war in 2002, 2003, it was not easy to voice that point of view. But certainly 20 years after, especially after the debacle, the very visible one for sure in Afghanistan this year, it was not only a failure in terms of democracy, but also of treasure and life, both for Americans and allies, as well as the local people. And I worked in Africa. I can say exactly the same thing. In some countries, you have Indians who have all of the commerce, like in Eastern Africa and so on. And as we've seen with Rwanda, when you shuffle the ethnicities in the same territories, first of all, democracy breeds, and pun intended, people, children, yes, so that you can outvote the enemy, the other. And yes, it's very difficult to get mature democracies like in America, and we'll discuss about that, like in Switzerland or others, when you have different groups of linguistic groups and ethnic groups. The more recent books that you wrote, for example, Political Tribes, deals indeed on how there's a fragmentation that has become much more acute in the Western world, in the Western democracies, who start to look like what we used to see in developing nations or more tribal-oriented nations. How did you go from those thoughts into A World on Fire to this Political Tribes book? What was the evolution of your thought?
So here is where I was saying I felt partly vindicated, but also I feel like I had to make a correction, because for 20 years, I always said I was critical of U.S. foreign policy. And I said, we are so ignorant about other countries. Americans are the worst. They just think everything is like the United States. And I said, we are always going to get our foreign policy wrong if, as you were mentioning, we don't know all the different tribal dynamics, the religious and sectarian, ethnic things in the countries that we're trying to help. But it's a very funny story. When I started writing in 2016, or no, maybe 2015, this new book, Political Tribes. It was just going to be about foreign policy. And I was teaching a class that I've taught for 20 years. And I remember it was right after Donald Trump had been elected president. And oh my gosh, the United States was in chaos. All of the elites did not predict that he would win. And everybody, yes, and I did. I got that right, you know, and it's in Political Tribes. So it was very similar, a kind of ignorance that was parallel to the ignorance in Iraq. I mean, but in our own country. And I remember the mistake I made. I was telling my class, Donald Trump had just been elected for 2 months, and my class everyone was crying, you know, because Yale is where I teach is very liberal. They hate him, and they viewed it as just a tragedy. So I was giving a lecture the way I always give a lecture, the same lecture for 20 years, not talking about Donald Trump. And I said, you know, unlike the United States, in developing countries, poor countries, under certain circumstances, democracy will sweep into power a demagogue with no political experience, no economic skills, who sweeps to power to the horror of elites by tapping into deep social resentments and playing the racial card or the ethnic card. And I stopped because, believe it or not, I was reading a passage from World on Fire about Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. But I stopped, and there was a dead silence in my class, and then a young woman raised her hand and said what everyone else was thinking. Professor Chua, what you described sounds just like what happened in the elections here that swept in Donald Trump. And then a light bulb went off, and that's when I had 3 months to completely redo the thesis of my book. And now the thesis of Political Tribes, which came out a few years ago, is just as you say, that I like what you said, that, you know, the way I put it is that today, for the first time in American history, we are starting to see destructive political dynamics in the United States that we used to think only happened in developing countries, like ethno-nationalist movements. Today, we have openly white nationalist movements. I mean, we've always had some small, but this is now a huge, it's very mainstream, you know, and we have lurches towards authoritarianism. And the worst that I've seen, which I predicted, but I never imagined would happen this fast, is the erosion of trust in our institutions and electoral outcomes. You know, you mentioned that you were in Africa for some time. You know that they have one constitution, then they pass a new constitution, then another constitution. And we were always so proud in the United States that we had one constitution. Everybody respects the Supreme Court. You know, if we have election outcomes, everybody respects it. Even I have to say, I'm shocked. I mean, you know, we have half the country right now that thinks that Donald Trump didn't really lose. You know, people want to add more seats to the Supreme Court. And we're going through a lot of chaos right now. And I wrote this book to explain why at this moment. And I think countries of Europe may be a little different. I think there are some parallels, but in the United States, I think, you know, why for the first time do we start to look like Venezuela or Iraq or Indonesia? And I think there are two factors. The first is demographic. We, unlike the countries of, you know, Switzerland or Italy, we are a nation of immigrants. And we've had massive immigration since 1965. I mean, huge numbers. And especially in the last 20 years, immigrants who are not white, you know, immigrants from Asia or Latin America, and so for the first time in US history, whites, you know, white people are about to lose their majority status at the national level. If you look at the US Census, the predictions say around 2044, 2050, whites will become a minority in this country. And there's a lot of disagreement about what that will look like, you know, what is white, but basically that's already happened in many major cities. And the reason that's important is that all of these studies show You know, it used to be that it was only the minorities in this country who felt threatened. You know, the African Americans felt threatened. Muslim Americans felt threatened. But now, for the first time, you can see it in the political dialogue, whites feel threatened. We have political parties that say whites, over 50% of Americans believe that whites are discriminated against more than racial minorities. And it's when everyone feels threatened, you know, the whites, the blacks, the Asians, the Latinos, women, men, that's when they retreat into tribalism. They become much more us versus them. They can't afford to be universalist and generous, and they become much more insular. So that's the first factor. And I think in Europe, you have a smaller version of this. It's not so dramatic that you're going to, I think in some cities, whites may be losing, but in America, we're talking at the national level. And the second factor brings us full circle. I had mentioned this idea of market dominant minorities, and you're exactly right. I used to think only in developing countries, you know, the Indians in countries like Kenya or Uganda, or the Lebanese in West African countries, or whites in South Africa. But what I say in this new book is that for the first time in US history, we, I think, are starting to see our own very strange, idiosyncratic version of a market dominant minority. And it's not an ethnic, it's a little different. It's not like the Chinese, or it's not a one group, but it's a little group that, I don't know if you know this term, we call them coastal elites, or our cosmopolitan elites. And I think in London, you have the same thing. You know, it's a group of not all white, you know, in fact, they can be immigrants from Nigeria or India or Asia, but they're not an ethnic group, but they are perceived as being a very snobby, you know, they all go to Ivy League, they live in New York or San Francisco, they all vacation in the same place, they're very cosmopolitan. Yes, and so Donald Trump, the way he became president was exactly like, you know, in Zimbabwe when Robert Mugabe said, you know, vote for me, you know, Zimbabwe for the black Zimbabweans. Donald Trump basically said, these coastal elites, they don't care about America. They care more about the poor in Africa. They want to be part of Europe, you know. They don't care about you poor white Americans. Vote for me. And he said, you know, make America great again. And he actually said, let's take America back from the Mexicans and the Chinese. So it's a little bit different because it's not one ethnic minority. So it's more like an analogy. But there are a lot of parallels, Piero. You know, these coastal elites in the United States, it really is true that almost all of the wealth in the United States is concentrated on either the West Coast or the East Coast. You know, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, the media, all, you know, universities. And you can see that there is so much resentment among poor, rural, country, blue class workers against these coastal elites. They think of them as these kind of corrupt outsiders. And that's a big dynamic going on in the United States right now.
Now, this leads me to, it reminds me, one of your books, I think was A Day of Empire. And if I can read the title correctly, it's How Hyperpowers Rise to Global Dominance and Why They Fall. The second part is interesting. And that book, when I read, I remember it was 2008, perhaps.
Yeah.
It reminded me of that older book of, I can never find his first name, Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Douglas Kennedy?
I think Paul Kennedy.
Paul Kennedy.
Yes.
Paul Kennedy,
yes.
A book on rise and fall of empires. And indeed,
of great powers, yeah.
Great powers, which is like an empire, really.
Yeah.
And the American empire or nation has become de facto an empire in the world throughout the 20th century. It has been the American century. And we are right now in a sort of Thucydides gap, where China is becoming the greatest economical power in the world, and tracking the United States on military power as well. And we see these two big, one is definitely very strong in terms of ethnicity, in terms of the future, vision of the future. And United States, which is a country I really love a lot, I've worked there and I've lived there. But today, and as you described, these political tribes are tearing the country in a centrifugal way to rip apart cities against, as you mentioned, cities against countryside, women, men, minorities, yes, one against the other. And this is not the recipe to maintain an empire. How do you foresee the next few years, especially when there is a challenger, China, coming up?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an honor that you remember that book, but that book in many ways is so relevant because the thesis of the book, this Day of Empire, I looked at something called hyperpowers, these huge empires that basically dominated the whole world. And I had a definition, like I was talking about really dominant, like Roman Empire and the British Empire and the United States. And I talked about like Tang Dynasty China in the 9th century. People didn't know about those so much. But my thesis was very, very simple. It was that I noticed that even though these empires were so different, Rome and the Persian Empire and China, the United States, they all had one thing in common, which is that they were all relatively open and tolerant on their rise. That is, they were able to use the best and brightest. You don't think of the British Empire as tolerant, but what I mean was they were able to, people don't remember this, but they were a religiously tolerant place compared to Spain. So all the Jews from Spain were leaving. They went to Amsterdam and England. All the Protestants that were leaving, the Catholics, and it became a place that people went, a magnet. And back in the ancient days, it was different. Rome, I said, the only way you can build the world-class army is if you take people from every country, every skin color. Whereas if you're like the Spartans, you say, I only want pure-blooded Spartans, you're going to have a very small empire. But the important part of the thesis is the decline. Yeah. Because I also found that in every case, all of these great hyperpowers, when they were declining, it coincided with a turn to intolerance and xenophobia and this kind of hatred. And of course, this is very relevant for the United States right now. I was saying there's a lot of tribalism, but right now in the United States, there's a lot of anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-Chinese. It's like the country is closing. Half the country is anti-cosmopolitan. So it's a very interesting thing whether this formula that, I think the formula for the United States, a country you love, my parents were immigrants, they saw it as a land of opportunity, was, okay, it's a country with a lot of problems, they had slavery, but this is where people can go from any place, for opportunity. And now when you see some of the language, this America's a white country, or America's only a Christian country, or America's enough Chinese, or enough, this, you wonder if some America will change. Now, meanwhile, China, I wrote back in 2008 that China can become it is a very great power. I'm Chinese, but it's a completely different formula, completely different model. It is the opposite of an immigrant nation. It has no immigrants. It's a very ethnically homogeneous country. And it's 95% Han Chinese. And so it's a very interesting case because they don't really need immigrants. My mom used to say China has too many people, a fifth of the world's population. So it was an interesting test case for my thesis. I said, I think China can be very strong, but I don't think that I predicted that I don't think it can dominate the whole world. And, we have to remember, Piero, it's much more normal for a world to be multipolar. It's very strange when you said, when you have the American century, that's very unusual. If you look at all of history, like Europe, it's much more normal to have 3 or 4 or 5 different powers, all kind of sharing, going up and down. It's quite unusual when you have a situation like one power is so dominant for centuries. So it may be that we're going back to a multipolar world where you have China and United States. And I mean, what do you think of Europe? I know you write about this also, and people sometimes talk about there was a time when people thought the EU was going to be the biggest challenger. And I predicted, like you, I thought those tribal differences, it was a dream,
Well, my first book, which is my best-selling book, Survive the Economic
Yes,
Collapse in 2011, predicts that, of course, the Western world, America, but also Western Europe, will have major collapse. And I
yes.
predicted the collapse to start around 2020. So
Wow. Okay. Wow,
we're
you
in
got
the
that.
we're there, and the Europe is not a political power. It is a bureaucratic. European Union is a bureaucratic machine who seems to have to work on its own ideology. And for example, as you mentioned, indeed, immigration in America has always been, people were never forced, except the Afro-American slaves, were never forced to come to America. It was a land of opportunity. It was hard. A lot of people died on the way, and then while in the country, it was not necessarily super clean, because of course the Native Americans
Yeah,
had something to say about it.
yeah,
But then this is survival of the fittest anyway. So this is the
yeah,
history of the world. But it was a land where you could do a lot. My father worked in America for many years. I did as well, and we made great success. Me in
yeah,
San Francisco in the internet space, but certainly in Europe, people who come to Europe now, they don't come to succeed. Most of them come for subsidies, and
ah,
this is encouraged by the ideology gone mad, I think, in my opinion.
yeah.
And our fellow writer, English, very fine English gentleman, uh,
Neil Ferguson?
Neil Ferguson as well. But I was thinking of Madness of Crowds recently,
Oh,
which wrote The Strange Death of Europe. Oh well,
yeah,
name will come back again. Wrote about this bizarre approach of a lot of handouts, so a big socialist approach mixed with ideology, which does not make success possible, because when you come into a place and you're given handouts, I think it's extremely racist approach, or at least for sure racially class by class, not necessarily by ethnicity, but certainly when you take people from Africa and you say, come to me, I'll give you money, but make sure to vote for me. This is not the way you develop the economy or even the skills of the people. And by the way, you also empty Africa, for example, of his own brains and doctors.
yeah. And my focus was very consistent, but a little different. And I think this is a perfect connection. When you do that, also, the secret to these hyperpowers I talked about was you have to have something giving the country some identity, giving the empire some, I called it glue, to hold it together. And in America, it was always this American dream and the Constitution. But if you have too many people coming too quickly and they don't have opportunity, or as you say, they're in a different class, it's very difficult to have one common identity. And I think that is also what I was saying is I noticed that was a problem in Europe, and in the United States, we're having that right now. Right now, for all the different reasons I mentioned, half of the country, it used to be that if you're a Republican, you could disagree with the other political party, fight, but they would marry each other. I mean, it would be, civil. Now, it's almost like half of the country views the other half who voted for the other side as un-American, as evil. I mean, so, and don't marry my children. They tell their children you can't marry. So it's almost like a civil war where you don't view yourself as part of the same country. So I think we're talking about some of the factors you mentioned contribute to that feeling too, that, I think it's really a problem.
Douglas Murray was the author name I was
Oh, yeah.
and the how do you see the next 5 to 10 years in the West, especially America, considering this political tensions? And we should add to the current split to one additional split, which is people who are for passes and vaccine. I'm not even sure I can use that term on the internet anymore. Well, the needle, and the people are against the needle, and this is another split. So you are atomizing the landscape in one more way. And my question is, do you think that this is going to lead to, you mentioned civil war, it's probably a big word, but certainly I think it's to be underestimated. But you see these centrifugal forces breaking up the society, the fabric, which in empires is what is necessary to keep it together.
Exactly. In our country, it may be a little bit different. In the United States, this COVID vaccine split is exactly the same split as the pro-Donald Trump or anti-Donald Trump. It's very strange. I mean, it's illogical, but it shows how, something we haven't talked about, at least in the United States, the role of the media and social media. It just really makes everything worse because you just hear you only listen to people you already agree with. So if things just get more and more. I am thinking about doing my next book on exactly this question, because I think of China and the United States as having opposite models. China is authoritarian, which of course I'm not in favor of. But in a way, America right now is suffering all of the dysfunctions and the problems of democracy, whereas China in many ways, again, I am not in favor of authoritarianism, but you can see that it has many advantages. China, I gave a speech and I said, in China, the government controls the internet, so they can make everybody very patriotic. In the United States, the internet controls us. So we're all tearing each other apart, and China is trying to address inequality, United States also, but here we're fighting and fighting, and China, they just went after the billionaires. I mean, I'm not in favor of that, but it's very efficient. And China, again, they have no racial and ethnic problems because they're so authoritarian. Of course, the way they treat the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, they have terrible, serious problems and moral problems, but it's very functional. So you're asking a very good question. So I'm thinking of exploring these two things. I have always been an optimist. I'll say this in my last few words. I mean, every book, even though I have very sort of scary thesis, I always think that we can overcome these things. For the first time, I am very worried about the United States right now. I actually, to tell you the truth, was quite hopeful with President Biden. I saw him as a moderate candidate. And by the way, his chief of staff very much liked the book Political Tribes. So I think he was trying to be more of a unifying candidate. But if you read in the newspapers in Europe about what's happening in the United States, it's a mess. I mean, he has very low poll approval rates and all of the same tensions, race, the COVID vaccine problem, the immigration. We have Black Lives Matter here. It's not getting better, So one view is that it's growing pains and that there is a silent majority that really is exhausted and just wants to be able to have dialogue. And I do believe this. I see this at Yale, where I teach, that a conversation like what you and I are having, I think most people want to talk like this, but for some reason where I teach, you can't talk like this. You just, you're going to get in trouble. You have to say certain things or you'll be canceled, so I'm hoping that over time, so many people will be targeted that will come back to rationality and something more peaceful, but it's a very difficult time right now.
Well, Amy Chua, thank you very much. I know we're out of time, but I thank you very much. Perhaps to be done another time as well to see how things progress over the next few years. I will put the link to your books in the description of the video. And once again, I thank you very much. And
thank you. It was great. Let's see. Maybe we'll both be wrong, and things will look up.
Let's hope for sure. So
thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.
Bye.